Dave the pharmacist here again. We are on part 5, I think, of our series about medications that you get after a heart attack. If you remember back to our very first session, we said, you walk out of the hospital after a heart attack and you end up with 6 drugs. And you're sitting thinking, what am I getting all these drugs for? And so what we've done so far in the sessions prior to this is we've knocked off all of those drugs that the average person gets after a heart attack. So hopefully we've left only cholesterol pills as the ones on your list. Hopefully we've checked all the boxes off. So to recap, when you got out of the hospital, you probably were given 2 antiplatelet medications. We talked about that in part 2. In part 3, you probably were given 2 blood pressure / heart medications, beta blocker and ACE inhibitor, or a beta blocker and an ARB. So that's 4 drugs that we've talked about. In the next section, we talked about nitroglycerin. You might have got a nitroglycerin spray or maybe even a patch to put on your skin. Nitroglycerin would be 5 drugs that you were prescribed. And the last drug that is recommended by the experts on for people after a heart attack is the cholesterol-lowering drugs. The most common, the drug of choice in lowering cholesterol for the past, 15, 20 years has been the statin family of drugs. In this day and age in Saskatchewan, you probably only got 1 out of 2 drugs. Really, the docs are only prescribing 2 of these statins for cholesterol lowering after a heart attack right now. So you probably either got an atorvastatin or a rosuvastatin. So here's those 2 drugs written out. Atorvastatin was originally marketed as Lipitor, so people might be calling this Lipitor. The other drug, this rosuvastatin, was originally marketed as Crestor. So, like I said, there are other drugs in this statin family. The reason why we call them statins is because they, of course, they all end in a statin: atorvastatin, rosuvastatin, pravastatin, fluvastatin, lovastatin, simvastatin, all these statins. But again, in this day and age, in our area, there's only 2 of these drugs that are really being prescribed right now to the average person. So you either got one or the other. The cholesterol lowering area has been really interesting in the last couple of years because there have been some new drugs that have come onto the market that are really interesting. And I think over the next couple of years, we may see some more of the other drugs being used. I won't talk too much about the other drugs for now. I think if there's interest out there, I can certainly, we can talk about cholesterol-lowering drugs, the new and the interesting coming up in cholesterol-lowering drugs. But for now, we'll just talk about the statin drugs. They're still the drugs that are given to most people after a heart attack. And so that's where we'll start. So before we talk about the cholesterol-lowering drugs themselves, I'd like to just again back up and give you a little bit of background about cholesterol lowering itself in the body, and cholesterol, managing of cholesterol in the body. So we'll talk about sort of the basics, and it will help us understand how these cholesterol drugs work later on. So let's get started. First off, if you have got a blood test lately and had a cholesterol test in it, let's look at the type of numbers that your doc will get if you do a blood test for cholesterol. A blood test that takes cholesterol will give a doc, if you go get a blood test for cholesterol, the doc will get a readout of 4 or 5 numbers after that cholesterol test is done. So they'll get a total cholesterol number, and a total cholesterol number sort of represents
the main components, the different types of cholesterol floating around in your blood. So that total number, after a heart attack, the doc won't spend so much time looking at that total cholesterol number. Really more, the doc will be more interested in the components of cholesterol, specifically this one called LDL, or low density lipoprotein, is what that stands for. LDL cholesterol. You may know LDL cholesterol as bad cholesterol. So, if you read the anything from the American Heart Association or the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation or anything from Europe, oftentimes they'll call LDL cholesterol the bad type of cholesterol. If you look at the LDL number is the good cholesterol. So these two types of cholesterol, bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. And then one type of this test that you'll get is a result for triglycerides, and these are just tiny little fats. And we're going to call these right now naughty. So traditionally we haven't thought of them as bad cholesterol, and traditionally we've really focused on lowering the bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, after a heart attack, where we haven't spent as much time focusing on triglycerides, or those little fats floating. That said, there's a new drug coming out here that might change our perspective on this in the next few years. But again, we'll save that and see what happens and see how the experts recommend managing triglycerides. But for right now, most of you probably got a statin to lower your LDL cholesterol. To clarify why they call LDL bad, here's my simple drawing of a blood vessel, and we've got lots of LDL particles floating around inside this blood vessel, floating around in your blood. So the reason why they call LDL cholesterol bad is because we know that people who have higher levels or higher amounts of LDL cholesterol floating in their blood have more or higher risk of heart attacks than people with low amounts of LDL cholesterol floating in their blood. So it's called bad simply because people with lots of LDL floating in their blood typically are more likely to have a heart attack, and we know that for sure, and that's why it's called bad. On the other hand, HDL cholesterol is called good cholesterol, and the reason why it's called good cholesterol is simply because the opposite is true about the LDL particle. So in this case, we know that people who have higher levels of HDL cholesterol floating around in their blood, they seem to be protected from heart attacks, or they have fewer heart attacks compared to people that have low HDL. So in this case, they call it good because high levels or lots of HDL particles floating around in your blood seems to, for some reason, be associated with a lower risk of heart attacks. So simply, that's why this stuff is called good. It looks like higher is better, and that's why this stuff is called bad. Higher is worse. So that's the general idea between bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. Now I have to go against the grain for a couple of minutes, and I just want to talk about the idea of cholesterol itself and this idea of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. So these have been really useful tools to sort of educate the public about, the idea of cholesterol and HDL and being aware that high cholesterol in your blood can be associated or increase your risk of heart attacks. But in some ways, the way that we talk about these in these public health campaigns, the way that we talk about them isn't exactly accurate. So I just want to just to be clear, I want to make a couple of things, a couple of statements to you that I think will help us going forward in talking about our drugs for cholesterol. The first thing I want to say is that cholesterol, there is only one type of cholesterol. So let me clarify my statement here. But this is a statement, I think, that if we want to really understand what's going on here, I think we have to get really wipe away all the sort of public health stuff and the simplification. I work in a college of pharmacy, and so I have a lot of colleagues who are chemistry experts. And so if I go to my an expert in chemistry who actually knows about the actual molecules and what atoms are in these molecules and how they're configured and how they look, if I go to one of my chemistry colleagues who is an expert and I say, can you draw for me what good cholesterol is and what bad cholesterol is? Can you draw me the different molecules and how they look? That chemistry expert will say, Dave, you're crazy. There is only one cholesterol. Cholesterol is a molecule made up of atoms, just like water is a molecule made up of atoms, H2O. So there is no good water and bad water. There's only water. Water has oxygen, and it's connected to 2 hydrogen atoms, and so that's why it's called H2O. Cholesterol has way more atoms in it. It's a bigger molecule, but there is only one cholesterol, just like there's only one molecule. There's only one water molecule, at least as far as I know. So this idea of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol is actually just a bit of an oversimplification. So in fact, we probably should think about these good and bad cholesterol a little bit differently. And I want you to I'm just going to present to you a sort of framework to think about this to help us navigate this issue. First, to get to the bottom of what these molecules are, we have to just talk a little bit about how substances move around in the blood, first off. Okay, so cholesterol and fats are fatty substances, fat-soluble substances. And so they're very different than water-soluble substances in the way they can travel around in the blood. So the blood is kind of a liquid, as you know, that is water-based. So there's water in there. That's why, your kids can go take one of those big Slurpees that has, 35 grams of sugar in it, and they can just down those crazy sugar drinks very quickly. And the one thing about sugar and salt also, but the one thing about sugar is that sugar is soluble in water. So when you drink a big sugar drink, your stomach really doesn't have to do anything. That sugar can just freely absorb into your blood because it dissolves in your blood very easily. Just like if you throw some sugar in your coffee and you stir it around, that sugar dissolves in that coffee, just like that sugar will dissolve in the blood. And then it will just travel through the blood, and it can go and have access to all different kinds of cells and all parts of your body, just because it dissolves in the blood and it moves very easily in the blood. Now, take a fatty substance and put it in your coffee. Take a lump of butter, put it in your coffee, or take some olive oil or some kind of canola oil and pour it in your coffee and stir that around. Well, what do you get? Well, oil and water don't mix. You know what I mean? So we know actually that fatty substances don't dissolve very well in water and water-based substances like drugs, like blood. So the body has developed a way. So that means when you eat fatty substances like fats and cholesterol, the body has to have a way to distribute all of that stuff around in the body. We talked about in one of our previous sessions that your heart muscle cells can use little tiny fats to burn, create into chemical energy. If there's oxygen available and they have little mitochondria gas stations to create the gasoline, they can use little fats, but those fats have to get to the heart for the heart to be able to use it. Same with your muscles if you're exercising. So in essence, the body has developed a system of vehicles or cars or trucks that drive fatty substances around in the blood. Those fatty substances are little fats and cholesterol. So essentially, if we think back to a blood test for the different types of cholesterol, and we'll just look at that again. The LDL molecule and the HDL are particles, I guess. The LDL particles and the HDL particles, they're not cholesterol or different types of cholesterol. Really, what these are is they're vehicles or trucks that carry fats and cholesterol around in the blood so that they can distribute in the blood very easily. So basically, your stomach, if you eat a big cheesecake or some fatty thing tonight after supper, all those fats cannot just be dumped into the blood directly like sugar can. They have to be packaged into vehicles, and it's the vehicles that drive them around in the blood. So essentially, when we talk about LDL and HDL, and there's other kind of particles like this in the blood, but these are the two that are most commonly referred to. Just think about these vehicles as trucks that carry fatty substances around, cholesterol and fats, because they cannot dissolve into the blood on their own. So if this is an LDL particle, you'll have these little fats inside an LDL particle, and you'll have cholesterol inside of here, and this will be a pretty big, crazy big molecule with all this kind of stuff. And on the outside, they'll have these special molecules that interact with the water to allow this to just suspend itself and float around in the blood without, dissolving out like what would happen if you put oil into your water or something. These things will suspend themselves in the water and allow the cells of the body to be able to access them if they need them. So hopefully that makes sense.
So we're now, when we're talking about cholesterol, good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, we're just really talking about these vehicles, like LDL is a vehicle. And so, I think then the use of these vehicles is obvious. So let's take LDL, because LDL is the sort of focus. It's the target of cholesterol-lowering drugs. So let's talk about the use of LDL in the body. In fact, we talk about LDL as being bad cholesterol, but in fact, LDL has a use in the body. And probably 100,000 years ago, I always refer to sort of cavemen and ancient humans when we talk about heart disease, because I think it explains a lot of the issues that we encounter in today's world. So if you think about LDL about 100,000 years ago, and somebody in a hunter-gatherer who doesn't eat that much, and when they do eat, they don't eat a lot of fat, they don't eat a lot of cholesterol, because they're eating largely a plant-based diet. And so when they do get fat and when they do get cholesterol, these are very valuable resources for the body. And they want to make sure that the cells of your body have access to them, because it turns out that cholesterol, the actual cholesterol now, not the LDL, but the actual molecule of cholesterol, is something that we all need to survive. All of us, every human needs cholesterol to survive, because cholesterol seems to be a really useful molecule. And we use cholesterol as a basic building block for many of parts of our body. For example, our bodies are made up of cells, brain cells, heart muscle cells, kidney cells, skin cells, all connected together in an amazing way. And so all of the cell membranes, of course, the way that a cell has to work is it has to have a nice cell membrane or a skin on the outside of it to make sure that it doesn't, it can separate the middle important part of that cell from the outside world. So as it turns out, cholesterol is a basic building block or a brick that is used to make cell walls. Cholesterol is also used to make hormones and lots of things. So it turns out cholesterol must be a really, really useful molecule. It is a really useful molecule for the body. And so cholesterol is not necessarily bad. It's good as long as you have a good balance of cholesterol, your demand versus your supply. So let's take an example about how cholesterol and LDL cholesterol is used in the blood. And I'm going to use let's just use a simple example of a cell. Let's say just right on your skin, a skin cell. It's the easiest way to show how cholesterol and LDL cholesterol actually can be good. First thing before we start is one unique thing about cells in our body is that the majority of cells in our body actually have machinery that can build or create their own cholesterol. So if you've got a basic molecules, if you've got a supply of the basics molecule in a cell, that cell can stick that into an assembly line or a factory inside the cell and make its own cholesterol if it needs it. So let's look at what we mean by that. So here's a skin cell. One skin cell out of probably, I don't know how many billions of skin cells that cover our body. Here's one skin cell. And this skin cell has a membrane on the outside that will be made, that will need cholesterol will be a big part of the sort of building blocks of this cell membrane. And inside, here's the cell's nucleus where they keep their DNA, the copy of all of the information, the map of your entire person is kept within the DNA. So, one of the things that is important for a skin cell here is that this skin cell, let's say that you have an accident, or let's say a caveman has an accident, and he has big scrapes in his skin, and so he has a wound on his skin that needs to be covered over very quickly, otherwise it's going to get infected. So so imagine you've got a caveman just had a fight with a tiger. Tiger scratched up his arm, and now he's got these big gaping wounds in caveman's arm. Now back in caveman days, there are no hospitals. There are no way to fix that up. There are probably some natural ways and some mud they'd stick on it. I don't know. But again, really, it's really important that this caveman, it's important that his skin divides very rapidly to try to cover over the exposed part of that arm. Otherwise, it will get infected and he could die, or whatever. So for caveman, it was really important that those skin cells divide and cover over that as much as possible. So this skin cell, if it's anywhere near the area where that injury is, this skin cell is going to have to divide. It's going to have to divide into two. And so, of course, the way it would do that is once it's stimulated to divide, basically what we'll do is it will start to make more cell wall. It'll make enough cell wall for two cells. So that's kind of how it will look, and then it'll copy up its DNA, its sort of the guts of the cell. It'll copy up that DNA to make two cells, and then of course eventually when everything is ready to go, then that one cell will just have divided into two. So that makes sense. This is probably happens all the time. And skin cells need to divide just like all sorts of other cells need to divide into two. Now, if this is a very big wound, now this cell is going to have to divide, that cell is going to have to divide, and then hopefully by tomorrow morning or in a little while, enough skin cells will be made so that that injury can be covered over and essentially save this poor caveman's life after fighting a tiger. Brave guy. So, think about this process and think about how much cholesterol is going to be needed
because this guy's got to make all this cell wall, and then this guy's got to make more cell wall. So even if this guy has enough, if he has enough resources inside his cell to make his own cholesterol, so as I said, that there is machinery inside these cells to make their own cholesterol, but of course you need to have the resources, you need to have the basic ingredients to do that. And then if this caveman hasn't eaten in a long time, maybe this cell doesn't have a lot of resources to be able to make enough cholesterol to do this. So anytime a cell in the body doesn't have enough resources to make the cholesterol it needs, what it does is it will build on the outside of that cell, it will build a receptor. Now, I hope that you, if you looked at our section on beta blockers, our blood pressure / heart medications, you should already be familiar with this concept of a receptor. We talked about a receptor for adrenaline when we talked about beta blocker medications. But in this case, this is not a beta receptor. This is an LDL receptor. Now, I wonder, hopefully you're starting to think about already what this LDL receptor would be. So here's a skin cell. Oh, sorry, I forgot to draw the guts of it here. Here's a skin cell that has the machinery to make cholesterol, but that machinery is not able to work right now because it doesn't have the resources inside the cell are not enough. So this cell needs cholesterol to replicate or to make more of a cell wall. So it will make an LDL receptor on the outside of that cell wall. And I won't talk too much about receptors because we talked about them with adrenaline, but hopefully you'll remember and you'll be able to kind of see that this LDL receptor, of course, what do you think that's made for? Well, it's made for an LDL particle. And so LDL particles that are floating around in the blood can come. If there's an LDL receptor out, it can park on this LDL receptor. This LDL particle can park there. And once this has grabbed an LDL receptor, so this LDL receptor, once it has LDL on board, it will essentially eat or engulf this LDL. So now this LDL is inside the cell, and then the cell will attack it and break it down so that the cholesterol is released. And now this cell has cholesterol that it has taken from the blood. This LDL has basically acted as a donor of cholesterol to a cell that needs it. Now this cell can go on and do its dividing and make its cell walls as it moves. So I hope I'm changing your perspective on whether LDL is actually bad. In a normal situation, in a healthy situation where there's a balance between the supply of cholesterol and the demand for cholesterol, really, we want you through a good, healthy diet, through lots of physical activity and exercise, your cells should develop a hunger, a demand for LDL. So we want your cells to be using that LDL as you need it. So, of course, in caveman times, in times historically when humans didn't eat near as much as they do now, LDL was probably critically important to keep the processes of the body going. But of course now we have incredible supplies of LDL, of cholesterol. So we eat cholesterol like crazy. We eat lots of saturated fat, lots of high energy foods. And so a lot of these things can be converted. And so that probably our cells right now, plus I would say we don't fight tigers very often anymore. So we don't have big wounds that we need to cover over anymore very often. So it's essentially what's happened is in the old days that LDL was a critical donor of LDL, a
a critical donor of cholesterol for your cells that needed it to make more hormone or make new cell walls or cell membranes. Nowadays, we still have, our body still creates a lot of LDL, and but our cells really probably have a lot of resources, and they don't need to use that external cell source of LDL anymore. And so that's where probably the level of LDL particles floating around in our blood in a human in 2020, in the year 2020, is probably way higher than what it used to be, in historic times when LDL was a really useful particle that it was used by cells all the time. So nowadays we have an issue probably with a lack of use of LDL, a lack of basically LDL receptors are not expressed, they're not made as much and sucking up the LDL that's floating around in the blood. So we have more LDL floating around in the blood than we ever used to. So LDL floating around in its blood by itself is maybe not necessarily the worst thing. There's probably something else that happens to make LDL bad. We've got these LDL particles that really aren't being used very much. And so there's an interesting theory behind how this LDL ends up causing us trouble and contributing to heart attacks, which is basically what we're talking about here. So I don't know if you've been watching the videos, hopefully you recognize this terrible picture. So what I'm starting to do here is draw a blood vessel. We've seen this blood vessel a lot. I've started to draw a lining of endothelial cells. We've talked about endothelial cells before, and we'll see how they play a role here as well. So these endothelial cells are supposed to be, covering the walls of blood vessels. And so, this is a normal state of affairs. And in the normal sense, and endothelial cell lining, these endothelial cells should be shoulder to shoulder, protecting the wall of the blood vessel, and monitoring stress. And we talked about how they make nitric oxide, and they make many other chemicals that can help keep this blood vessel being healthy and allowing blood to travel through it very easily. We also talked about, how endothelial cells can become damaged sometime from high blood pressure or other things, or sometimes they can develop gaps between them. And so, regardless, let's take an LDL molecule. So here's LDL particles floating around in the blood, and here's a gap in endothelial cells. So sometimes, this LDL can actually kind of sneak in through some of these gaps inside on the other side of the wall of this LDL of this blood vessel, and so we can get LDL that can penetrate behind the blood vessel wall, so here we are, a couple of LDL particles that have penetrated inside the LDL wall. Again, maybe I'll just back up to see, here's the inside of the blood vessel, and here's now these LDL particles inside the wall of the blood vessel. So that's probably okay to some, in some way. It's certainly okay if there are cells in here that could use that LDL. So, of course, though, in this day and age, the cells underneath this layer of the muscle wall, they probably in this day and age, they don't have their LDL receptors outside. So these LDL are of no use to these cells back here. And so here they are, just probably sitting around, floating, doing nothing. I would say personally, my own theory also is, for those of us adults in Canada or the United States or anywhere, we probably don't get enough physical activity and we don't exercise enough. And so, this blood probably isn't getting flushed out as much as it should. The heart isn't pumping hard every single day. And so there's probably not really great as good of flushing of fluid out of these vessel walls. And now I don't know, maybe that's not true, but to me that makes sense.
But so here we have some LDL that are kind of stuck in here. And, that may be okay, but there's one chemical reaction that occurs that probably turns these LDL actually into bad LDL. And it's a chemical reaction called oxidation. These LDL molecules can go through a chemical reaction called oxidation, or in other words, they can become oxidized. The reason why I say that to you now is because many of you might have come across supplements and vitamins that are called antioxidants. So, if you've heard about antioxidants, and these are very popular products, antioxidants. Antioxidants essentially are used to prevent the chemical reaction, in this case of oxidation. Now, oxidation reactions can occur with lots of different type of materials. They can occur in DNA can be oxidized or undergo oxidation. And so antioxidants have been used or thought of a tool to prevent damage to your DNA, and then of course the resulting problems of cancer that can happen. In this case, oxidation of LDL is the focus of people who use antioxidants for heart disease. So let's say that these LDL molecules that are stuck behind the blood vessel wall, let's say they sit there long enough and they encounter other molecules that are reactive and cause reactions, maybe waste products, and you may have heard of free radicals and oxygen-free radicals. So all our cells generate molecules that can be kind of reactive and can react or cause chemical reactions with other molecules that they're not supposed to. In this case, LDL can become oxidized. And oxidized, and I've put little squigglies around the LDL to show that these LDL are oxidized where this one isn't. So this chemical reaction of oxidation is probably a really important step, or a dangerous step, I should say, in the development of heart attacks. What happens if these LDL particles become oxidized? An oxidized LDL particle, or an LDL particle that has undergone a chemical reaction and has become now oxidized, which I guess basically, if you're a chemistry guy, means that they lose electrons. So if you lose electrons, if some molecule has stolen electrons from you, then losing that electrons will turn your molecule into being oxidized or oxidated. So there's something strange that happens here, and I'm not smart enough to know what it is. But once an LDL particle becomes oxidized, it seems to fool the body, or it changes the way the body sees it. So an unoxidized, a normal LDL particle, the body sees that as just a regular particle that, is a good donator and it doesn't cause trouble. In fact, it can help donate cholesterol or little fats when you need it. But if it becomes oxidized, for some reason, it looks different to the body, and your immune system or your infection-fighting cells see oxidized LDL as an infection or some kind of damaged cell that has to be removed from the body. And this is where a lot of the trouble starts. So if an immune cell or if an infection-fighting cell comes into contact with this LDL, well, it will activate the infection response of the body. And so a number of things will happen. A cell will see this LDL, and it will start sending out chemicals, danger signals of chemicals that will be sent out into this area. And so what happens, there are infection-fighting cells that float around in the blood, and they will be attracted to this area. The endothelial cells will play a role in attracting these infection-fighting cells and bringing them in to the point where this LDL is. So here is an infection-fighting cell that has been called to action by the chemical messengers that were alarmed by this oxidized LDL. And so essentially this guy will go to this LDL, it will see it as an infection, and it will basically try to eat it. It will just eat it up, just like the LDL is done, just like the LDL is sort of swallowed whole by an LDL receptor. But in this case, it's done by an infection-fighting cell. So normally these infection-fighting cells will try to will break down this LDL. And usually LDL is easy to break down, but for some reason, this oxidized stuff doesn't break down inside these infection-fighting cells. So as this cell keeps going, it will keep eating more and more LDL molecules until it is just swells up really, really big. It'll just keep eating. It'll become insatiable for these LDL particles. So you've got all these LDL, you'll have this big infection-fighting cell that has swallowed these huge amounts of this LDL. And I didn't write this, sorry, because I'm lazy, but it will be full of LDL here. And of course, if it does that right here underneath the wall of your blood vessel, then, you can imagine what happens. So you can imagine what happens. These big infection-fighting cells have swallowed all of this oxidized LDL. They can't break it down. They keep swallowing more. The danger signals are still causing the muscle underneath to kind of move up and push this even farther up. And of course, what you end up with is this is the picture. If you've been following our pictures, again, I am an incredible artist, as you can tell. The picture that we drew at the very beginning, I think in our second section, was a picture of a blockage inside a muscle cell that can rupture and cause all this trouble. Well, now we've sort of talked about how this blockage can occur in the first place, and we talked about endothelial cells being kind of damaged, LDL floating around in the blood, entering, becoming oxidized, and then causing all of this trouble inside the wall of your blood vessel. And so hopefully all this is sort of coming together for you now. I realize it took me a long time to get here. The other issue with these blockages, as you can see, is they're associated with these infection-fighting cells that can sometimes send out chemicals to say, here, let's have more infection-fighting cells come, and this is basically can be thought of as inflammation or swelling inside your vessel wall. And you all know what swelling looks like if you've ever had an ingrown hair on your face or an ingrown toenail in your toe. You know what swelling feels like. Swelling can cause lots of pressure, and if it swells very fast, it can cause this skin over top to sort of rupture apart. And rupturing of this is something that we have talked about before. So our current approach to trying to reduce the burden of this LDL, the LDL initiation of the swelling or inflammation in the wall of your blood vessel, is to try to just reduce the amount of LDL in your blood. So the fewer numbers of LDL particles floating in your blood means the fewer number that are going to penetrate past your endothelial cells, and then the fewer that are going to add to that to get oxidized and then keep causing that inflammation to keep going and more danger cells. So if we can stop or slow down that process at least, and slow down the number of chemical danger signals that are being released by your immune cells, then we can sort of reduce the chance that that thing will ever break apart and it won't grow anymore, and that's sort of our goal. So that's what these statin drugs do, and here's how they work. So time for another incredible drawing from Dave. This is a drawing of your liver. So essentially your liver is a organ that just sort of filters blood. So blood comes into the liver and it runs by all these cells that sort of take out toxins and metabolize things, and so it's like a big filter, and then the blood comes out the other side and goes out about its business, but cleaner than it was when it went in. The statin drugs that you use work primarily on these cells in the liver. And the way it works is, if you remember back in the day, a few minutes ago, I told you that cells in the body have their own machinery that can make cholesterol. A statin drug is a drug that goes to the machinery, and mostly for statins, it's inside liver cells. So they'll go to this machinery and they'll block or inhibit one of the steps that is necessary for a cell to make its own cholesterol. So of course, what does a cell do if it cannot make its own cholesterol? Here's a test. Do you remember? I don't know if you remembered or not because I can't hear you. But essentially what happens is a cell that can't make its own cholesterol will build an LDL receptor. An LDL receptor, right? And that LDL receptor will collect LDL from the blood to get the cholesterol it needs. So if the unique thing about the liver is the organ that really filters all the blood. A ton of blood goes through this liver every minute. And so there's a huge blood supply going through. And so if you look at a liver before you take a statin, there probably are a few LDL receptors sticking out, but not that many. If you take a statin drug, the statins go to these liver cells, and essentially what they do is they inhibit each of these cells, probably not all of them, but they inhibit the machinery to make cholesterol. And so what do you get after all of these cells can't make their own cholesterol anymore? Well, so what I've done is I've just drawn LDL receptors that are now produced in way higher quantities in these liver cells. So imagine now this LDL that's coming in as part of the blood and floating through here, much of this LDL is going to be picked up by these liver cells now, because all of them, and of course not all of them, but many more of them have LDL receptors sticking out of their cell walls. So the LDL that's coming in here is going to be picked up by these cells, and so when it comes out the other side, there's going to be way fewer LDL molecules on the other side coming into the bloodstream as there were on the inside, because they're now getting used preferentially by the liver. So essentially what the statin drugs do is they don't lower LDL by themselves. They just make your liver cells pick up more LDL so that your LDL is actually being used, and the liver cells are not using their own supplies. They're using the supply from the blood. Now, of course, on the other side of that, let's go back to our picture. If you have less LDL floating around in the blood, that means you're going to have less LDL penetrating into the cell wall, fewer LDL particles becoming oxidized, and if they're not becoming oxidized anymore, then the immune system or the infection-fighting cells are not going to get upset. They're not going to be pumping out all this chemical to make this whole thing so inflamed. And then ultimately, if we can reduce all the activity in here, and if this thing doesn't grow anymore, if there's no more danger signals because there's hardly any LDL around, then our goal here is that, we hope that this shrinks a little bit. Now, just a warning, the question we always get in cardiac rehab is, can these shrink all the way back to normal? And I just want to, tell you frankly, we think, we know that they shrink a little bit, but they shrink very, very slowly. And to some extent, they can get smaller, but we probably wouldn't expect these to shrink right down to zero unless we did this for a very, very long time. So essentially, though, it actually doesn't matter in some ways, because as long as we stop the activity in here, if we stop the activity, again, by if you exercise lots, if you're lots of physical activity and a good diet, then we can ensure that the LDL you have in your blood, you're using it for good reason. It's not getting locked up in here. And then if it's not, this thing can shrink a bit. But even if it doesn't go away altogether, if it doesn't grow, if it's not growing really quickly, then essentially, what is thought that happens is I'm not drawing this very well, but a really thick skin will grow over top of this this blockage. And if this really thick skin grows over top because it just basically has been stable and static for such a long time, that this will just kind of harden up like any kind of cyst or anything in your body that just doesn't move. And if this skin gets really, really thick on the top, this little fibrous cap, then it won't break. It can't break. And really, this is where, for those of you that maybe have had a stents put in, we know that some people get stents put in, but maybe the doctor couldn't get at some of their blockages. There might still be blockages left in there, and there might be blockages that you can't see because they're too small at the time. We're really pretty certain that it's okay that you didn't get a stent on all of your blockages, as long as we take care of all of these things. If we take care of LDL, we take care of diet, we take care of your endothelial cells, that if we can just stop the activity inside those blockages, the vast majority of people don't even know they happen, know that they're there. So our goal in the short and long term is not necessarily to get rid of all those blockages. Frankly, we don't really think it's possible to do that. I know if you look on Google and you can see all these products that just clean out all your blood vessels, 35 years of blood vessel blood vessel inflammation just cleared up in 2 weeks. We really don't think that's possible. But in our view, the practical goal here is to stabilize those things. Obviously to shrink them, but to stabilize them so they don't grow. If they don't grow, it means they're not inflamed, and that means they won't break. We want them to harden up and then shrink slowly, but to stabilize them and keep the endothelial cells on either side of those, to keep those endothelial cells on either side of your blockages to be healthy, and on the other side so they don't expand, they don't grow. And that's our goal about how we try to, prevent heart attacks in using all of these things, statins, blood pressure drugs. And if they do rupture, we have antiplatelet family on board to try to reduce the reaction of platelets that might plug up the whole vessel. So that's been a lot of talking by me, a lot of sessions. Again, you should be critical of me. You should be critical of this whole system. I tell you all these fancy stories about how they prevent heart attacks and stuff. But again, I want to be really clear. we do not have a cure for heart attacks. So we can't give you these drugs and say, you're never going to have a heart attack. We know that we prevent some heart attacks. Some people avoid heart attacks. For example, for these statin drugs, the way these statin drugs got on to be recommended by the expert committees is they would take cardiac rehab folks like you, people out of the hospital after a heart attack, split you into two groups. They give half of you a statin drug, half of you would get placebo. Placebo, if you've ever heard of that, it's a pill that looks just like the statin pill. Can't tell the difference except inside it's just got starch. No statin, just starch powder. So, half of the group gets the statin drug, half of the group gets the placebo, and they just follow those people over 5 years. Interestingly, in the studies that have been done, we started seeing these studies in the mid-90s for statins. And, they would give people everything else. Everybody, both groups got, antiplatelets and beta blockers, and they got everything else. But the only difference is that one group got a statin and one group got the placebo. We see that in the group that gets statin, if you follow them for 4 or 5 years, you see, 30% fewer heart attacks. So fewer people in that statin group get heart attacks. Some people still get heart attacks. They don't stop at all, but they stop some people. And we're not smart enough at this moment to know who avoids a heart attack and who doesn't. But frankly, this looks like a pretty good deal. You basically, if you take one of these drugs, you choose a team, the team that has fewer heart attacks or the team that has more. Obviously there are issues with these drugs. There are safety issues sometimes. I think they're pretty safe, but we do have the most common problem that people have with these statin drugs is some people get muscle aches and muscle weakness when they take them. I kind of find, some people can take these drugs and feel totally fine, and some people can't. They just so struggle with muscle aches and pains. So I'll tell you, if that happens to you, be patient. We're not very smart about who is going to have a good experience and who is going to have a harder time trying to find a way to be able to take these drugs. And there's some people that cannot take them. So, try your best if you're interested in this strategy to reduce risk. Try your best, but don't beat yourself up if you really can't take them. We usually experiment. We try atorvastatin and rosuvastatin, and then we go to pravastatin, and we try all other kinds. Be patient, and eventually you might say, can't do it. Can't take these drugs. And some people really, truly can't. So, but I think a lot of people can if you're patient. So, that's sort of the biggest thing we find with these drugs. Again, there's other things. Back to this issue about risk. We do not have anything to cure you from your risk of a heart attack. And I know if you've had a heart attack already, that's kind of scary to think about. But I'll tell you one thing that we can do. I think that these medications have proven to help some people. Some people will not have a heart attack because of these drugs. And because of the others. So it's not just the drugs. It's eating right, getting physical activity, lowering stress, not smoking. It's all the things, living a good, healthy lifestyle. All of these things will really, really help lower your risk. And I think the way to look at this is this. If you have had a heart attack, one of the things that we want to do is we want to lower your risk for another one. And the way I think you should think about it is this. Everybody in Canada or the United States or wherever, everybody in Canada wakes up. If you're an adult in Canada, you wake up in the morning. Everybody who wakes up in the morning has a risk of a heart attack. Everybody. The problem is the guys that haven't had a heart attack, they're not as aware of it as you. Our goal is to allow you to lower your risk to a level that your risk of a heart attack tomorrow when you wake up is the same risk for somebody your age. And so everybody in Canada, or lower, but everybody, when you wake up in the morning, everybody in Canada who is an adult might have a heart attack today. We want your risk to be the same as everybody else your age. We do a really good job of that for most people. Again, depending on how much damage you have, depending on your other situation, your risks might be higher than somebody your age. But for a lot of people, we can get your risk to that level or lower. It's all about, having good, effective strategies and sticking to them. The last thing that people will say is, well, do I have to take these drugs for the rest of my life? We've talked a little bit about antiplatelets. You can dump one. We talked a little bit about a beta blocker. For those of you with no damage, you can probably dump one of those maybe. You can have that conversation with your physician in the future at least. This drug, statin drugs, we think that as long as you take it, it keeps this condition, this inflammation, controlled in your vessels, and we think that you're protected as long as you take it. So we would probably prefer you to keep this on indefinitely, unless you have problems. If this causes you grief every day, if you're stressed out because you're in pain every day because of it, it's not worth it. But for those of you that can find a way to take it and feel fine on it, and there's a lot of people that can, we recommend that you keep on it indefinitely. So, folks, we did it. I got one more session coming up, just about pain and fatigue that you may be feeling after your heart attack. Many people are really tired, but from the drug perspective, we've now covered off all 6 drugs that are recommended in the average person who've had a heart attack. Thanks for hanging in there. If you've really hung in there and tried to watch these have been long videos. I hope they're useful. I hope we're back into the actual cardiac rehab class and we can meet face to face and talk about your questions. In the meantime, you can maybe throw questions here in the YouTube video and I'll check them once in a while. Or you can phone, the nurses at cardiac rehab and get in touch with me there. So I hope this was useful in our COVID era cardiac rehab heart medication teaching class. It's been good to meet you, and